In this video, we're going to add a variety of different mouth shapes that your character can use whenever he does the lip syncing to a track. Before you get started, you should have downloaded the Mouth Shapes JPEG. In this, it'll give you a reference that you can use for your cartoon character. Now keep in mind, this is just a reference. You can change up or modify the shape and look of these mouths based on the needs of your character. So don't think that they have to look exactly like this. Just use this as a reference. In the video, I'll kind of point out what to look for whenever you create each of these different shapes. So let's get started. Now, by this point, you should have already finished creating the entire head for your character and have that head already grouped together on one layer. So let's double click on our head to go into the isolation mode for it. And then let's zoom into the mouth and double click on the mouth to go into its individual isolation mode. Once here, let's go down to our timeline, and we need to create 3 separate layers. On this first layer, I'm going to call this the mouth shapes, and inside of this is where we're going to draw off each of the different mouth shapes. On top of it, I want to be able to label each one of these. So I'm going to call this label, and I want to create one more layer, and this was going to be our reference layer. Inside of this reference layer, with it selected, let's place the photograph of all of our different mouth shapes. So from here, let's go to File and Import, and we'll import it directly to the stage. From here, choose that Mouth Shapes JPEG. We'll say Open, and if need be, we can scale it down and move it over. So I'm going to move it off to the side, grab my Transform tool. Be sure to hold down Shift when you scale it down, and we'll place it down right here. Now here's how this is going to work. Each of the different mouth shapes needs to be drawn in a different frame along our timeline. So we want to be able to recreate these on top of our character and be able to label them and place them inside of here, and then select the appropriate frame whenever is necessary. Now, since I already have one mouth shape for my neutral position, as if he's not talking, what would he look like, already established on frame 1, let's go ahead and label this one. This is where the label layer is going to come in handy. So select the first frame in the label layer, and let's go over to our properties panel. And inside of this panel, locate the frame subpanel and the label subpanel. From here, we can give it a simple name, so we'll call it neutral. It may be difficult to see at this time, but we've simply labeled that one neutral. If you want to be able to see it, you can go over to your timeline scale. We can drag it out, and you can see this will start to show the label by itself. This will simply mean it's labeling whatever is below this particular layer. Now we need to create another frame and draw off another little mouth shape. So going over to these next ones, select the second keyframe and hit F6. From here, we don't need to have this mouth shape, so we'll delete it away. This will be labeled Ah, so AH. So selecting the label in frame 2, go over to your properties, simply call it Ah. Doesn't have to be perfectly named, whatever you place on there. Then we'll go into our mouth shapes layer and we'll redraw off this particular shape. Now looking at this very closely, here's what Ah is doing. And sometimes it may help to look in a mirror as you draw this off. But essentially you're saying Ah like in father or far away or something like where your mouth is fully open. We can see the teeth sometimes you can see the tongue. But what we're showing is the mouth fully open, getting that overall sense. So the cheeks are spread wide and the tongue is visible and the teeth are visible. So I want to be able to draw that off and see that within my character too. Now you can use whatever tool you think is necessary. For me, I'm going to be using just my regular paintbrush tool. Going over to my tool properties, I'm going to turn off object drawing mode just to make it a little bit simpler to draw and to paint inside of everything. And I'm going to try to match the style that I've used for my previous drawings as well. So whatever I draw for lines, that's what I want to keep for him too. Now when you draw, do make sure you're working in the mouth shapes layer, and in my case we're working on frame 2. So I'm going to draw off mouth wide open as well. We'll fill this in with some black, so I'll go over to my fill bucket tool, paint bucket, normal one, change my fill color to be a solid black and fill it in. Now in order to show the teeth and also to show the tongue, this is where I can use my paintbrush tool, my regular brush tool. We'll go over to my tool properties. The mode that I want to be working in is going to be paint inside. This will allow me to paint inside this area and not affect anything else on the outside. Do make sure that object drawing mode is turned off, and I'm going to change my fill color to white so I can paint the teeth and adjust the size of my brush appropriately. In my case, I think it's looking good. Now when I start to paint inside of this, whenever I let go of my mouse, you can see it automatically clips to inside of that. Pretty easy. If I want to be able to paint the tongue really quickly, I can swap this over to, let's do a red. I'm going to do a little bit darker red, and then paint just a small area for the tongue. Now notice when I did this, it didn't paint inside of this area, it painted behind it. The reason for that, I'll do Command Z to undo, is whenever you start to paint, make sure your brush is inside of the area that you want to affect. So there I started plainly inside of the mouth, and so it stayed inside of that area. If you start painting outside and then go in, it's only going to remain on the outside of that area. Alright, so I've got my ah established. Now I can go through to the next one and paint off and draw it as well. Just make sure to keep your mouth relatively the same size as you paint each one of these. The step-by-step process will be exactly the same. So we'll go down to our layer. Let's create a new set of keyframes on the third one this time. We're going to change the label, so select the label layer. In this case, we're doing a D. We'll go to the frame properties, type in D. Then we can go down to our mouth shapes layer. Let's get rid of everything on this layer, so delete it away. And then use your drawing tools to draw off this mouth shape. Repeat this process until all of the different mouth shapes are created. Alright, now with this done, you can see there should be 12 different mouth shapes, each one on its own individual frame. With that done, we can go down to our timeline, and we no longer need this reference layer. So I'm going to click on the reference layer and trash it and delete it away. And then we'll return back to frame 1 for our mouth. From here, let's go back to our full head layer, and let's place on our audio so that we can add the lip sync track to it. Now this part's going to be a little bit tricky to how Animate uses audio tracks, but your audio track needs to be in the same symbol as your mouth is. So in our case, we're in the full head that we created, and this is where the mouth layer is. So we want to add the audio track to the full head placement. So I'm going to create one more layer at the very top of the full head. We're going to call this the audio track. And this is where we're going to place our audio. Now to find the tracks that you can use, you should have downloaded a set of poems from the class Moodle page. I've divided each of these poems up into female or male voices, so you can choose the tracks that are appropriate to your character. Since I'm working with male, I'll open these up. And one thing to note about the labeling of each one of these poems, you'll notice that they start off with A, B, or C. Now that has nothing to do with the grade. That simply indicates the length of the poem that you're placing on there. An A poem is about 1.5 to 2 minutes long, whereas a C poem is around 30 seconds long, and there's everything in between. You can pick whichever poem that you feel most comfortable working with. To place the audio, let's go back to our Animate file, and we'll go up to File, and let's import it to our library. File, Import to Library. Let's locate the poem that we want. In my case, we'll do the male, and I want to do God's Grandeur. Remember, if you can't select any of these files, just make sure all files is enabled. We'll say Open, and this will import it directly to our library area. Now that it's in the library, let's assign it to this audio layer. So in the timeline, select the first keyframe on the audio layer. Let's go to our Properties panel, and inside the Properties panel, let's choose the sound that we want to play. In our case, you can see when you click on None, there's the MP3 that we want to choose. Now when you go to your audio layer, you can start to see the sound wave appear. We need to add as much room as possible so that we can see the entire sound wave. To do this, I'm going to scale down all of my timeline so I can see a lot of it down here. And we're going to go to the very end, in this case as many frames as possible, and hit F5, and you can see the rest of the sound waves start to appear as you add on more frames. Now we simply need to keep moving until the entire sound wave appears. So I'm scrolling down, and this entire thing is about a minute long. So in my case, this particular poem ends around frame 1641. So from here, I'll just trim off the rest of these by selecting that and hitting Shift F5 and do that. So add on enough frames until you can see the entire audio that you're working with for your poem. Once you're finished, you can return back to frame 1, and then we can scale down our timeline until it's back to normal, and we can see each of our individual frames. Now, as we play through our audio, we want to be able to hear what it sounds like as it passes over. And if I move my playhead now, you can tell that there's no sound coming through. Here's one thing that must be turned on if you want to be able to hear it while you're working on your animation. Going back down to the sound, change your sync from event to stream. With stream turned on, when you move your playhead, you'll start to hear the audio as it's played through. And if you hit return and play, you can see it also plays through like normal. So having that turned on is good as you're working so that you can hear the individual frames. Later on, we can turn it off. Now, of course, if we add a bunch of frames to one layer, we need to add frames to all of the other layers as well. So carefully scroll back to the end of your audio layer as well. Oh, there it is. And let's click and drag on the very last frames for all of the other layers, and then hit F5 to add some frames to it. So this way it'll show up wherever it is. Now we can go back in and do automatic lip syncing for this layer. Now with that first keyframe selected on my mouth layer, you can see as I move the playhead, all it's going to do is cycle through all of those different mouth shapes. And that's obviously not what we want. We want it to change its mouth shape as it fits the audio that's playing on the audio layer. Used to, this was a very tedious process involving setting keyframes and picking and changing certain frames. I'm going to show you the automatic method of doing it. So again, let's select the first keyframe on the mouth layer, and I want you to click once on the mouth itself. This will take you to your Properties panel to have the object selected. If you look at the bottom of this panel, you've got an option for looping, and you can see by default it's going to just play the graphic in a loop over and over again. And that's what it's doing and why it's playing all those different graphics. If you wanted, you could tell it to choose a single frame from the graphic, and that's what we want to do for here. Now back in the day, you could open up your frame picker, and in the frame picker, this is where you could choose whatever phoneme that you had. Notice that in the frame picker, you've got your label, and then it shows you a preview of what that frame would look like. Again, this is the older way of doing it. We're not going to do it this way. Instead, with the mouth selected and single keyframe option selected too, click on Lip Syncing, and this will open up your lip syncing dialog box. From here, we can set the different visemes and mouth positions for all of the different phoneme sounds that it's going to create. Now, for this particular version of Adobe Animate, there is a known bug, and I'm going to show you how to work through it. Usually, you're supposed to be able to click on each one of these and it'll have a little pop-up, but you can see it's not popping up. In my version, this bug has not been fixed yet, but there is a workaround. If you want to change the position of it, let's say the neutral is okay, so I'm going to click on the ah, hit your spacebar, and this will have it pop up. Now you can select the ah from this one and hit the space bar one more time to select it, or excuse me, hit the return key to select it. Let's do the same for the D. So select it and hit space bar, choose the duh sound and hit return to enter it in there as well. So space bar and then return to match up for each one of these different ones. So there's the F, the L, M, O, R, S, and woo. Hopefully in the future, they'll have this nice and fixed up, and so it makes it easier just to click on it and have your pop out. The second thing we need to do is to attach our audio layer. Now remember, we placed our audio track on a separate layer that's above the mouth, and we named it audio. So we're going to sync it with the layer, in this case, that's named audio. When we say done, this will take just a few seconds, but Animate's going to go through and listen to the audio and select the appropriate viseme to match up with the phonic sound that it hears. Now it may not be 100% perfect, but we're going to play through and test it. Once it's finished, now you can see that it's added keyframes and changed it up to the appropriate, or what it thinks is the appropriate phoneme for that part of the audio. And if you play through, you get an idea of what it looks like.
God's Grandeur by Gerard Manley Hopkins.
Now this is a wonderful little time saver for placing all of your keyframes and getting it about 90 to 95% correct. However, take some time to play through your entire audio and look at the mouth shapes. Every once in a while you're going to find that Animate simply chose the wrong frame. So I'm going to play through just real quickly.
By Gerard Manley Hopkins. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil.
All right, so I found one particular part right there where he says ooze. I can see that it set the first keyframe as a oo sound, but the next keyframe goes to an sound, and it really should say ooh all the way through this particular area. So I'm going to change this M keyframe to an ooh keyframe. So with that incorrect frame selected, click on the mouth. Then you can go over to your Properties panel and go back down to your Looping subpanel, and let's open up our Frame Picker. With Frame Picker, this will give us all of our keyframes. Let's locate that one that we want to change it to. With it selected, you can see that it changes it up, and now I can go back and play it,
The ooze of oil.
and it plays much, much better. So at this point, take some time and play it through a couple of times to make sure each of your mouth shapes looks appropriate for the audio that you have. Alright, now that I've gone through and fixed all of my different mouth shapes, the next thing I want to do is to fix the audio so that it'll play through whenever I go to test my movie. If I was to go up to Control and to test my movie now, here's the way it would go. You can see that it's not playing anything, and it's also not playing any of the audio. We want to be able to have this loop through. So to do this, we need to go through our timeline and do some corrections. First off, we can remove the audio from our head layer. So select that audio layer and let's delete it away. Let's also make note of how long it took for this to play through. So I'm going to go to the very end of my timeline, and I can see it's roughly 69 seconds. The closest second should be okay for what we're doing. So that's going to be important for our main timeline. Let's go back to scene 1. And from here, let's have everything on our main timeline last for those 69 seconds. Now in order to do this, I'm going to scale everything down as far as it can go, and I'm going to scroll all the way over as far as I can. This may take a couple of times to do it, but you can select all of the frames on this one and hit F5 to add some more time. Then you can scroll along a little bit more, select a couple of frames, hit F5 to add some more time, and as long as it goes all the way to, in my case, 69 seconds, that's okay. If it's off by a little bit, that's why we tried to overcompensate and hit 65 from there. Now as I play through, it'll start to play. And we've got our mouth, but we need to add our audio. The final audio needs to be added to your main scene. So I'm going to back out. Let's go down to our timeline, and let's create one more layer on top of everything, and we'll call this our audio layer. And in our audio, let's select our very first keyframe, so frame number 1, and let's go to the frame itself and set the sound in our properties panel to the audio for your playing. Now for this one, you can set it to stream, and let's go back to the event. Now when we go up to control and test our movie,
God's Grandeur by Gerard Manley Hopkins.
It'll play through, and it'll also play up all the audio. Now that we're finished with this part, you can go up to File and do a Save. And let's do a Save As. I want you to turn in this particular part of the lip sync as its own individual file. So I'm going to say lip sync face with audio. And with the audio, this is what you're going to upload to Moodle for your exercise grade. In the next video, we're going to tackle animating the rest of his face and bringing him to life.